The Japanese occupation of Manchuria in 1931 boiled for 6 years until the fighting exploded on July 7, 1937. The Japanese invasion of China was swift and brutal. While the Chinese soldiers were brave and determined, they were outmatched in terms of equipment and supplies. The Marco Polo Bridge incident, which sparked the war, caused millions of Chinese soldiers to be recruited. Warfighter presents 2 expansions that cover the missions, objectives, and locations of the fighting that also presents the Chinese soldiers. To recreate the Chinese forces in Warfighter, you will need the World War II expansions number 22 and number 23. Expansion number 22 brings the following: 3 player soldiers, 2 non-player soldiers, and 7 squad soldiers. 2 mission, 2 objective, and 5 location cards. 6 weapons, 2 gear, 1 skill and 1 nation skill, 12 frontline, and 13 elite hostiles. Expansion number 23 offers 3 player soldiers, 2 non-player soldiers, and 8 squad soldiers, 9 location, 7 weapon, and 3 service record cards, 2 action cards, 11 frontline, and 11 hostiles. For the first few years of the conflict, the war did not go well for China. Constantly pushed back, the soldiers were undersupplied with inexperienced leadership. China lacked the industrial resources to provide much in the way of heavy weaponry, but they did offer some weapons that could be used against the Japanese. The Type 24 rifle was solid, if unremarkable. So was the MP-18 submachine gun. One of the more interesting weapons was the dado, a 2-handed sword that dates back to the Bronze Age in China. The weapon was used fairly extensively because of the shortage of firearms that plagued the Chinese army. Although short of weapons, the Chinese soldiers did not lack in bravery. They offered many of the attributes found in other armies at the time. The diverse nature of the environment is displayed by Chinese soldiers who resist the heat and the cold. But if there is one outstanding attribute of the soldiers from China, it was their numbers. The national skill of the Chinese forces in Warfighter is an interesting one. Recruit allows once per soldier turn the ability to bring in a squad soldier into the mission. At the cost of a single action and the experience points needed to pay for their recruitment value, a squad soldier is brought into the same location as the soldier who paid the action. For example, if An spends an action and pays 2 experience points, he can bring Zhao into his location. The power of this nation's skill is considerable, but limited to the experience points that the Chinese will gain through the mission. The 2 mission cards reflect the urban fighting that was common during the war. The use of nature location cards and market stroll reflect the time-consuming process of going outside the city to reach the objective. While patrolling the streets is more difficult due to the reduced loadout, but it also reduces the hostile presence on the objectives. The 2 objectives are fairly straightforward as well. Destroy the houses requires explosives to complete. This may reflect a resupply location for Japanese soldiers or a hideout for Chinese resistance. Clear the bamboo is quite simple. Just keep the objective clear for 2 turns. The Far East, as depicted in the location cards, is a far cry from the jungle terrain that Japanese forces would find themselves in the South Pacific years later. The rocky outcrop and gorge depict the difficult terrain that helped dominate the fighting. Contrast this to bare earth that show the desolation of much of the countryside. Even fighting in more urban areas that showcases the shanties and shortcut are also available in this expansion. The Chinese were in an uphill struggle against the invasion by Japan. Using a Fabian strategy, they traded land to stretch out the Japanese forces before managing to acquire some victories that halted their advances. For most of the war, both sides fought in limited actions as Japan's resources were being drained away by the conflict in the Pacific theater, while the Chinese were hard-pressed to gain much-needed supplies. The conflict reached a relative stalemate with occasional raids and one major Japanese offensive in 1944. By the following year, the Chinese were starting to gain ground, but before they could make major strides, Japan surrendered and the war ended.